All right, welcome, Brenna. Thank you so much for being here, being willing to share a little bit about your family's story about learning some parenting tools for a little bit more peace at home. I would love if you would just share for us, where were you at a few months ago before you decided to look for a parenting program?
Yeah, I would, and thanks for letting me, join to share. I would say, a little bit of context on where we were at. We had our youngest, who's 4 years old, had just started preschool, a new and different preschool program. Our oldest had just transitioned to kindergarten and had been on her own journey of managing anxiety. And, we had often used experts, but knew we needed something additional because the transition for my son in particular to preschool was really tough. And the behaviors both at school and at home were coming out as a lot more wrestling, a lot more kind of physical behavior that we didn't want in our household and we knew wasn't productive at school. And so my husband and I knew that we needed some more kind of dedicated focus to help our whole family, but in particular for our little guy to figure out where we could help adjust some of those behaviors.
I actually remember the first time you and I had met online. I believe it might have been the monthly gathering call that I host,
Yep.
and you had written something in the chat box about my 3-year-old is wrestling all the time. And I'm like, I have a 3-year-old like that.
Yes. All the time is the right way to describe it. Yes. And we had known another family that leveraged you and your services. And so did some research, joined that monthly call, felt just really nice about the connection, the type of advice, the way that you coach. And so it was a nice bridge into knowing like, okay, like we can, commit this time and the financial investment too to do something really good for our family.
Yeah, yeah. And so we'll talk about some of the things that you learn momentarily, but I'm curious. I feel like I really relate to you with the age of your kiddos and some of the
Yeah.
things you've looked at, even with anxiety and supporting
Yes.
your kids and supporting yourselves. And I was thinking about this morning about the process that we go through and the cost of raising children. And the cost meaning like staying in bed worrying, doing Google searches, talking to our partners. For me, that might be worrying to my partner or complaining and thinking somebody else is going to take action instead of me. Like, when are you going to act on this?
Yeah.
How about for you? How was your time and your mental energy being spent before you signed up for Mad to Glad?
A lot of those things that you just shared, like feeling like I was just on a constant search for advice and wisdom, and whether it was like small nuggets of wisdom from, an Instagram feed or following a number of different parent bloggers, coaches, listening to podcasts. It felt like a menu of options. And that was certainly very exhausting and then made it hard for my husband and I to get on the same page because I'd be sending him like little clips of things, and so I would say that was one of the biggest draws of having what I feel like is a single source of truth, something that both my husband and I aligned to and committed to say, like, instead of all the smattering of things, like, let's get really focused on a way of approaching and both on the same page, which felt good too.
Yeah, nice. So what were some of the concepts that you felt like you two could align with that were influential in your parenting?
Yeah, I would say, very first and foremost, that like concept of fire on the brain. And I think early, in some of the sessions that we joined, you joked that a lot of parents will also be like, oh, like that's actually me. My husband very much felt that way, that he was like, this is describing me as a
Not my
child, as
kid.
an adult, and so I think it was helpful for my husband and I to really ground in that and the science behind it. And then it just really described our kid, both kids, but in particular our son very well. And then understanding that concept of fire starters, like we were inadvertently just entering into conversations with our, now 4-year-old in a way that immediately put us on our back foot. Like we were doing ourselves no favors. And so as we started to just ingrain that concept a little bit more, the other saying, and I think it was said in, maybe one of our open chat groups, but the idea of kind of ignoring some of the misdemeanors and really focusing on the felonies, I think that was another important like concept for us. I'm like, gosh, parenting is hard and there are lots of behaviors that either, annoy us or get under our skin as parents, but really being clear about like what are the things that we're setting firm boundaries around and focusing on those so we didn't feel like we were constantly nagging the kids was
And
really
what were,
important.
yeah, what were some of the things that you focused on that you targeted?
wrestling being a big one. And then just there was some kind of like name calling things that the kids were clearly learning in school that were new things from the playground, things that, just like new sort of concepts that the kids were coming home with. Nothing of which was like so egregious that we felt like we really needed to like curb it, but just like we didn't want to get in the pattern of little things like my daughter would nag at my son and call him a baby. And that really hurt his feelings because to him, being a big kid is so important. And so we kind of set some really firm rules around, things that the kids were saying that were hurtful to one another. And so really tried to stick to that. Listening is another one that I wish I could say we had made as much progress on as the other two. It's, it continues to be a challenge because the kids are who they are and the ages that they're at, but trying to be set firmer boundaries on I'm going to say something one time and then have a realistic, expectation that my kids are old enough to do things on their own and not doing it for them.
Yeah, that makes me think about when I had taken my child to a parent toddler class before he was 2 years old at a Waldorf school locally.
Yeah.
And they would give instructions by saying, instead of it's time to put on your shoes, which with concrete thinkers and learners, I really like to say something like it's time or let's.
Mm-hmm.
But they would say things like you may put on your shoes. And they like brought this gentleness in. Or they would even teach kids to ask instead of like, can I have whatever? They'd ask, may I have
Yeah.
whatever? And I've been remarking lately that my son, after 2 years of being exposed to that, has been saying things like, when we'll be like, can you ask that differently? And I'll be like, oh, yes, may I have some elderberry syrup or like something like
Yeah.
that, which is one of those things where if you have the structure and you understand, like, how are we shaping communication and behavior, it still takes the process of natural child development for it to click on and the child to become more independent with it.
Yes,
Yeah.
which also feels good that like both my husband and I invested the time, had good conversation about each of the sessions, and even if we couldn't join live, would commit to listening to it either together or individually. And I think it just brought us a commitment and rigor for us that we had aspired to but hadn't committed to, and like, okay, here's the time, here's the money, and here's the outcomes that we're really looking for. And so it put some structure around it for us to say like, nope, we're in it because now we've committed to being part of this program.
Yeah, nice. Was there any benefit from the program that was unexpected that when you look back, you're like, oh, I didn't know that was something that was going to happen?
I would say I getting both Charlie, my husband, and I on the same page. I had felt like we were generally directionally on the same page, but being really clear and then allowing our through this program allowed ourselves more of the permission to call each other out on like, hey, I saw you do this and that actually wasn't what we agreed to. And it was less about then like nagging and more about like, okay, no, we both committed to this. And then it created more space for us to coach each other.
Yeah.
It was good.
Yeah, really nice. So, how does parenting feel now? And some of those things we talked about earlier with the worrying or the smattering of ideas and adding the next podcast or book to your list. How are you feeling?
I would say we feel more focused. And while I would tell you, like, wrestling has definitely gotten better. So that's one that I feel like we've made meaningful progress that I can point to. And some of the like name calling things that the kids were doing with one another certainly feels like it's made progress as well. And so, one, I would say, like, that's felt good. But just again, overall feeling like we have a structure and something that we can keep coming back to. Even before this call, I pulled out like all the notes that I had written down and I'm like, oh, this is probably, I need to put it back up on the fridge. Cause even as time goes by, then I forget about some of the little, like nuggets that were really good and I was good at for a few weeks. So I think just having those things, the one I was thinking of was that heartfelt appreciation, that kind of structure. I was so good about using that really specific equation for a number of weeks. I'm like, oh yeah, I got to dust that back off. That made the kids feel really good.
Oh, sweet. Yeah. And one of like my encouragement to you is that the 8 pillars that you learned, they really are rooted in the brain science and meant to be principles. So
Yeah.
when you dust that off, it's like, oh, it works at 3 and 4, and then it works at 8 and 10, and it works again at 14. And when the kids move away,
Yeah.
if it's a strategy that works at any age in childhood, it's gonna apply as well for them in later
Yeah.
years.
Yeah. I would also share too, unique to our daughter, who I had mentioned, struggles with anxiety, and she has a wonderful child psychologist that we see. Like, I felt like there was a really nice blend of the things that we were, kind of working through in this parenting course and the things that are in her toolkit. And were, so for us, it was a nice complement of all the experts in our life who are helping us with our kids, which
Mm.
also felt really nice, complementary to that.
Yeah, nice. So, why do you think, what is it about your personality and your beliefs about parenting and raising children that makes you open to something like growth on the parenting journey? Because not every parent feels that way. In fact, some parents feel like something like therapy or parent coaching can feel like a stigma. And of course, as a certified parent coach, I'm like, but wait a minute, you take your baby home with no like driver's education classes, or
Yep.
like you need more education as a teenager to drive a car than take home a baby. So, what do
Yep.
you think contributes to that openness? What are some of your values around family?
Yeah. I would say some of it is just that idea of continuous learning. Like, how would I possibly know how to be a parent if I've never been a parent before? And that idea of like, in my professional life, do, professional education, learning, skill building, and so it was very probably easier for me to say, like, of course, I will need to invest in skill building in other ways. And then
Mm.
I think too, some of what we had become accustomed to from working with our daughter, finding a set of, people to help us, whether it was through a pediatrician, child psychologist, we were already down the path of knowing how important help is. And then I think just like talking very openly to a group of friends that I have, other mothers who also get a lot of help in things, whether it's sleep coaching, whether it's, their
Mm.
own mental and physical well-being. Like I think just like really reflecting on if we have the privilege and the means to be able to continue to invest in ourselves as parents and our children, like to me, no better way to spend our money.
Yeah, sweet, sweet. Now I know that your schedule is full and you're a full-time working person. And so for other moms who are listening and they're like, I know, but I'd love to do this, but I have a full-time job and not to mention little kids and not to mention working on my health and all of these things that are happening in life. How would you advise somebody who's like doesn't feel like they have the time to do it? And
Yeah.
maybe because there's so much energy spent on things like wrestling and
Yes.
nagging or shaping behaviors.
Yes. Well, and I don't know if this is great advice, but my perspective was I'm already exhausted. And so, how might I just refocus some of the energy that I'm spending into
Yeah.
something that ideally has a better outcome than where I'm, you know, what was previously spending energy. And so, yes, certainly it's a time commitment, but I think some of that of like when my husband and I decided to make the monetary investment to do the program, that created an expectation then for both he and I that like we're in it,
Yeah.
which in some ways we needed. And I would say too, like, I didn't make a lot of the live classes because of work schedule, kid pickup, those sorts of things. And I would say my husband and I both found it just as valuable to be able to do the pre work, listen to the session, and then hop into some of those spot coaching moments with you that were just available and worked on our calendars. And so, even for folks that can't make the live cohort, I can attest to the fact that it was valuable to to have the rigor of it over the course of the program.
Yeah, nice. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience.
Yeah.
I am picturing the personal trainer myself because I do so well with accountability in my life. And
Yeah.
when you commit to something, it's like there's no way out. So you get to
Yep.
move towards the goal that you have for yourself.
Yep.
So if you had one final thing to share that was valuable, like how do you see the tools that you learned influencing how you feel as a parent, your relationship with your kids, your family's future?
Yeah. I mean, something that I would share is that my husband and I also talked really openly with the kids about going through parenting coaching, using outside experts to get help. And to me, the value of normalizing getting help is really important in our family and our values. And for the kids to see us need to do that. And also to say, like, and we're going to practice some things and some things will feel good and some things won't. That felt really good. And my hope is that, like, has meaningful impact on the kids as they move forward, just knowing one that we are really committed and invested to them. And I know they can't conceptualize it now, but I hope someday they understand, like, wow, how cool was it that our parents cared enough that they, got help to make our family continue to thrive. So that's my hope.
Yeah, wonderful. I have had this quote rolling through my head for the last day and a half because I'm going through some team member transition. And I was thinking about bringing on like a suite of team members to support some of the work I'm doing in the world. And the quote, which I haven't looked up in decades, is something like, if you want to go slow, or if you want to go slow, I think
Yeah.
it's like, if you want to go slow, go alone.
Yes.
And it feels like that for any behavior change, right? Like if you want to go
Yep.
slow, go alone. Like you'll figure it out. You have some good tools in your tool belt, and you can get the smattering. And like if you want to go far or
Mhm.
fast, like go together. And that's the whole point of this community, is to offer tools and do it together, so that it normalizes it for us too. It's okay for us to share vulnerable feelings, and that things are imperfect, and that we can grow through them and share successes.
Yes, agreed. And it was nice to feel like in those moments of joining the community calls or listening that I was like, oh, we're not alone. Sometimes that feeling and even a little bit of that like misery loves company, on some of the worst days when I'm like, why is no one listening to me? Why is everyone wrestling each other at the house? Like all those things that I'm like, and yet here we are, like a lot of committed parents coming together, swapping stories and not being alone is a nice feeling.
Yeah, very nice. A big thank you to Amanda, who had shared about my
Yeah,
program with your family. And I'm really glad that you participated. And thank you for sharing some of your story.
us too. Of course.